All right, thank you everyone for joining our monthly webinar that PharmaForce puts on. For my returning people, thank you again for always showing up and giving us your time and attention. We know it's valuable to all my new people. Thank you for coming for the first time. We do this once a month, 30 minutes. We try to be respectful of your time. We will open it up for you can always put your questions in during the webinar. After Anthony gets done with the presentation, we will go through all the chat questions and answer those. So if you can stick around after Anthony is done, there's always some great questions, some valuable feedback from the attendees. And so please stick around if you can. And I want to kick it over to Anthony. I know we got a big presentation here. This is so I'm going to kick it over to Anthony now. Thanks, Anthony.
Justin, thank you so much. Again, really excited to have this webinar. This has been to say that this is a hot topic. The Genesis v. HRSA is an understatement. It is the talk of the town in the 340B space. Let me introduce myself real quick. My name is Anthony, the webinar guy Velasquez. I say the webinar guy in quotes because that's what I get called when I walk around the 340B conferences and everyone says, "Hey, you're the webinar guy." So I've adopted the name. That's sort of our little inside joke to those of you that attend the webinars monthly. I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Product Officer at PharmaForce. I came from the covered entity. We're going to talk about audits today. I have personally gone through 2 audits myself when I worked on the covered entity side. So I know the topic very, very well. We had this topic already picked out weeks before the Genesis v. HRSA decision. And then that came out and it was just like a perfect fit into what we're going to talk about today. So I just wanted to say that. And let me also say 340B is under a lot of scrutiny from different folks in the healthcare industry, especially the manufacturer industry. And it is more important than ever to show that your covered entity manages their program well, that you care about compliance of the 340B program and that you're abiding by the policies and regulations of the 340B program. So I think this is timely. This is just timely just to take a step back and go through what a HRSA audit looks like and talk about how the decision that just came out may or may not impact the industry going forward. So with that being said, let's go right into it because we have a lot of things to cover today. I think I have like 45 minutes worth of content that I'm going to squeeze in 30. So let's see if I can do this. Let's see if I can pull this off. So let's go and start with the first slide. All right. So a little bit of housekeeping. Okay. So rule number 1 of all of our webinars that I do on a regular basis with Justin is nothing in this presentation should be constituted as legal advice. Okay. I hope that's clear. I'm going to be talking about something very controversial, so I have to say that to start. Okay. Then we have another rule. Rule number 2 is remember rule number 1. Okay. Nothing in this presentation should be constituted as legal advice. Okay. That's really important for me to say that, given the topic. All right. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just giving you my opinion from being in the 340B industry for over a decade. So, this is just sort of my opinion on these topics and some facts that are, straight from the legal ruling and different things like that. Okay. So here's the agenda for today. Number 1, I want to talk about the Genesis v. HRSA case breakdown. So just give you some perspective on that, what that means, what are the facts of the case, what may or may not happen in the future, because a lot of the industry is just speculating right now about what this truly means. Number 2, I want to talk about the current state of audits in 2023. If you are on this call and you have not been audited, that's great, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. So I want to talk about that and hopefully share some information that will have you better prepared for that event when it happens. I want to talk about HRSA audit process and trends. So I just want to talk about what that process looks like from beginning to end. What are some of the common findings? Some of this stuff is public. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but HRSA actually posts results of every entity that they audit on the website. On the HRSA.com, HRSA.gov website. So they post the audit results. So we're gonna talk about what those common findings are. I looked at all those trends, some interesting stuff in there. And then we're talking about corrective action plans. If that's you, you're in the middle of a corrective action plan, I wanna share some thoughts on that as well. Okay, so let's talk about the hottest topic in the 340B industry right now that everyone's talking about. I got a little treat for you guys. We are putting the full, I think it's 31 page, a full 31 page judgment in the link. So in the chat, we're going to post a link. You can download it there and you can read it yourself. I don't know if you like to read legal stuff. I generally don't like to read legal stuff, but I found that this was really, really interesting. So I encourage you to read the entire thing because I think it's super interesting just to see how folks that are not involved in our industry interpret our industry. So I just found that really fascinating. So let's get right into it. So what's the backstory on this Genesis v. HRSA decision? So Genesis Healthcare, an entity, I don't know if they're on this call because I think that's like the really, they're the cool ones on the block that took on HRSA and seem to be, have won. So, but they were audited in 2018 and they had diversion findings specifically on prescriptions that were written at a non-eligible locations. The court document seems to indicate there was nothing else, that there was no other supporting documentation for that prescription to be eligible. We would say something like, well, wasn't there a referral documentation or something like that? It seems like that was not the case. HRSA's particular language is very interesting in that they said that Genesis must have initiated the healthcare service resulting in the prescription. That's really interesting to me. I've been in 340B for over a decade, as I mentioned, including when the mega guidance was coming out and a lot of these other changes in the industry. And it's interesting that HRSA will write that because referral for consultation prescriptions are allowed in the program, and they don't generally give entity findings for that. So it's interesting that they took that approach. Genesis said, hey, we don't agree with that. We don't think that that's what the intent of the patient definition was. So a ruling came out on November 3rd, 2023, where basically the ruling agreed. The courts agreed with Genesis that the only statutory requirement for patient eligibility is for the person to be a patient of the covered entity. That could mean a million things, right? If you ask 10 different people, what's the definition of a patient? I bet you would get 10 different answers. But essentially, the court found that HRSA's interpretation of an eligible patient, as they defined in under my backstory bullet point, was inconsistent with the language of the 340B statute. So, fascinating stuff there to begin. Now, the court's expanded definition was really interesting. So basically, the statute basically does not, the court was saying the statute does not require the covered entity to have initiated healthcare. That's not explicitly spelled in there or outlined in there, and basically that the only requirement for patient eligibility is that the person be a patient, right? That the person be a patient of the covered entity. And the courts interpreted that, and this is really good for all of us that are in the 340B space, but that the courts interpreted that Congress' intent was for the patient to have its plain and ordinary meaning. So meaning that the individual is under awaiting care or under some medical treatment, okay? Again, those of us who have policies or have done policies in the past which said a patient is only a patient if they had a visit in the last year, like all of that is now in question, basically, based on this, this definition. Now, the court's expanded definition does says that the patient must have an ongoing relationship But what does that mean? Does that mean that the patient have to have had a visit in the last 3 years, 2 years, 1 year? So this is all really interesting. And there's sort of like what I'm seeing is a building of camps. So there's camp number one that is saying, hey, this means to throw away HRSA's definition of a patient and apply what the court said, what the court agreed with, et cetera, in the Genesis decision. And now we can capture every prescription from any patient that's a patient of ours, from any provider, from any location. I think that's an interesting interpretation of that. But there's also the sort of the other side, the other camp who says, hey, let's just wait here. HRSA has not changed anything. They have not announced, as far as I know, as of today. Maybe it happened today or in the last day, and I haven't checked the HRSA site. But HRSA has not announced any changes to the way that they define a patient or how they are going to conduct audits. So if you are under an audit right at this moment by HRSA, they are still using the 1996 patient definition that we are all aware of having established a relationship with that patient, provider under employment or contractual relationship, etc. Those sort of rules still apply. Now, the decision applicability, this is really interesting. I sourced a webinar that I attended by a law firm at the bottom here, but basically, you know, some folks, some you know, in sort of camp number two think, look, this really just applied to Genesis and just a single set of facts of the Genesis case. You know, the legality of HRSA's interpretation or guidance, it's better worded, was not really questioned or reviewed by the courts. And it's most likely that HRSA will appeal. If not, they have to provide clarification on what happens next, because we're all scratching our heads about what do we do? Do entities adjust their policies and procedures now and make the eligibility more patient-based instead of prescription-based? You know, like what happens now? And those questions are yet to be answered. And I do not have the answer to that today. So I hope that sort of explanation helped everyone and understand sort of like, you know, where the two camps are of more of a, hey, let's blow it up. Let's capture everything and anything for a written patient of ours at any specialist, et cetera, without referrals or anything like that because of Genesis decision, or the other side who's saying, hey, look, let's wait for HRSA to clarify. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're audited, they're still applying the same standards, and then, you know, you're found to have diversion. So Justin, before I move on, any comments you want to add on this?
No, I just say be careful at the moment. And
Yeah.
Kind of wait to see how it plays out. But it's exciting, not just because of the 340 savings opportunity, but think about the opportunity to for your uninsured patients that are doing care outside of your organization and being able to get those cash card discounts and pay 340 costs.
That's a really good point. The last thing that I'll mention is the applicability of this on basically hospitals versus grantees. It's also really interesting where I've talked to some grantees who their take is, oh, for grantees, we're all good because we're responsible for the patient care. So anyways, a lot of interesting stuff going on. Stay tuned. If HRSA does appeal, I look forward to speaking on this again, or if they share some sort of clarification, I think that will be interesting and exciting. All right, moving on to the current state of audits in 2023. What are we seeing in terms of the audit trends? And hopefully you will find some good information in here, some good nuggets of information to take back to your entity. So here we go. I read an article from 340B report that HRSA, I couldn't find this on their website, but HRSA had planned to do 200 audits in this year, and I believe they do fiscal years, not calendar years, but they had planned to do 200 audits. And if it's fiscal year, they're kind of on track for that. They've completed 81 audits so far. 52 of them have been closed completely. 28 of them are pending a corrective action. So that means they had some sort of finding, and now the entity has to go through the process of correcting that finding. And 16 of them led to repayments. 16 entities are currently going through a repayment process. I have gone through one of these processes. It is super painful and time consuming and really, really long. So you want to avoid being in a situation where you have to go through a repayment, because it consumes a lot of your resources, time, got lawyers involved, boards involved, and a whole nine. So you want to avoid that as much as possible.
Wow, that's 20% repayment. Wow.
Yep. That's what I have here. So 64% of audits had no adverse findings. Good. 35% had a pending corrective action. 20% are pending a repayment. So, it looks like there's some opportunities there for entities to, have an increased oversight over their program. Now, here are the finding types that I found interesting. So we have the ones that had no findings. So kudos to you. Again, it's public. You're listed on the HRSA database. We had 18 incorrect 340B OPIS records. So this could be things from the authorizing official that you have listed on the HRSA database is no longer the authorizing official at your entity. I think they give you a finding if you have the incorrect phone number. They give you a finding. If you have incorrect address information, you also will get a finding for incorrect 340B OPIS records. So, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's something that should be addressed, and it should be simple to review this on a quarterly basis, something like that, just so you don't have that. The next one is a duplicate discount finding. Now, I've worked in a covered entity. I worked in a state where there's a lot of gray and duplicate discounts. So I understand that this one is very, very tricky. But the duplicate discounts seem to continue to be, an issue. If you look back into sort of the genesis of the manufacturer restrictions, they are to prevent duplicate discounts. So this continues to be a hot topic under the radar in the 340B space. The good news is there was only one diversion finding. Compare this to 2-3 years ago, there were a lot more. It seems like, hopefully HRSA is being less stringent, or at the same time, I think entities are being more aware. There's better technology, there's more oversight, and those things are not happening. And then there was one no auditable records, which I'll talk about that and explain what that could be in a minute. So of the findings, 62% incorrect database records, 48% of audits had duplicate discounts. So that's a biggie. That's a big issue there that should be addressed. Okay, cool. I hope you found that all fascinating. I encourage you to go on the site, go to HRSA.gov. I think it's /340B. And there's a section on audits there where you could see sort of everyone that's been audited and their status, and they make it public for the world to see.
And the key there is people have to do more audits. They have to do more audits of their claims. I mean, if we can get that duplicate discount finding down to 1 or 2 and not 14, then the manufacturers can back off some. But you got to get those audits done and find a way to audit a lot more claims than it's being audited, so you don't run into those issues.
Yeah. And you know what? It's easier said than done. Like I've been there where like the state is just unclear on what to do, and and some entities don't even know. So it's difficult. Depends on the state. Some states do a better job than other in making clear what their policies are, what they're requesting rebates on. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. All right, so the HRSA audit process and trends. So if you've never gone through an audit, here's what the step-by-step will look like for you. Okay, so hopefully this is just a reminder of the process. So your authorizing official primary contact receive an email from HRSA. Okay, this is going to say, hey, you are the lucky winner of being chosen for an audit. If you have been audited before, by the way, you have a higher likelihood of being picked in another audit. So I was at an entity that had 2 audits in a span of 3 years. And nothing, there were some findings initially, and sort of like I started there kind of like the week after the HRSA auditor was there. So, I was responsible for helping, with the corrective action plan. But if you have been audited, the likelihood of you being re-audited are actually, pretty high. So once this happened, and actually this is why it's important for the authorizing official and primary contact to be the correct person in the HRSA database, because if it's not, then you don't receive this notice, and then that has other implications. And believe it or not, I've been at an entity where this happened, where actually it was a little bit different. The email went to the junk of one of the contacts, and we weren't able to get to it in time, and then it led to a threatening letter from HRSA later, and it was a mess. So we had to clean it up. Number two, then Bizel, who is the group that does the audit, they'll send an email with a link and schedule a pre-audit visit, complete a form that they need. Then the entity schedules the pre-audit visit. I see someone has a hand raised. We're gonna wait until the end and to answer the Q&A and the chats. Then the entity completes the information request. Again, this is I'm doing this really, really fast just for the sake of time, but just to give you an idea of what the process looks like. The entity starts working on the data request list. So that is compiling your policies and procedures, your claims, your purchases, your payers. If you're a hospital, your crosswalk, your Medicare crosswalk, etc. All that information has to be compiled. You complete the pre-audit visit. The entity submits all the data to HRSA by the deadline, and then the audit is sort of conducted. I want to say that everything is remote. I'm sure someone who has gone through an audit will say, no, it's not. They're doing it in person. I want to say everything's remote by now. I haven't been part of an audit for a few years, but I want to say everything's remote at this point. But regardless, that doesn't make the process less painful of going through a HRSA audit. Okay, now we talked about the common audit findings earlier in a few slides. So the top three were the incorrect database, the duplicate discounts, the diversion, and the no auditable records, which I kind of lumped together because they were very small. So what are some things you could do to lower your risk here? So the incorrect database records, this is not critical. It doesn't lead to a repayment or anything like that. But it's avoidable. It's unnecessary. It gets posted publicly. You don't have sort of that badge of honor said I made it through a HRSA audit without a finding. I don't know. I think it should be avoided, and entities can do this by one of the things that I did in the past when I worked on the entity side was to create a checklist, and that checklist will have, okay, these are things that I have to do monthly. These are things that I have to do quarterly, and these are things that I have to do annually. And that was sort of like my guiding principle for managing my 340B program. So one of the things that I did quarterly was to review that we hadn't, had the primary contact or the authorizing official information was still correct, that they hadn't changed offices or numbers or stuff like that, confirm that the locations that were registered were still open and were still operational and things like that. So that's something that you could do as part of a review. I know if you're a huge dish and you're managing a lot of entities, that's easier said than done. But in general, this is something that can be done fairly easily. Number two is the duplicate discount. This is serious. It does lead to a repayment. It's a pain in the neck, to resolve. It's a pain in the neck to just go through a repayment process with manufacturers, because it's sometimes most of them now reply. Back in the days, some of them didn't reply to you, or if it was under a certain threshold, they would say, "Oh, we don't care." Sometimes their contact information on HRSA is not even correct, so you can't reach the right person. So if you submit a corrective action plan and you're trying to sort of go through each one, it takes forever to do it. So anyways, review your list. Maybe, one thing is if you collaborate with others in your state, other like entities in your state, and kind of share Medicaid lists together. I know sometimes some TPAs have this, some don't because of risk and things like that. But also double check with your TPA, double check with your state. I think there's a tool. Apexis has a really good tool too to lead to some states that have a clear, list of Medicaid payers. But definitely check your TPA configurations regularly, especially those of you that have 2, 3, 4 different TPAs. Make sure that those are aligned and that those are being applied correctly across all of your TPAs. And then the last one, the diversion and the no auditable records. So this is really interesting. I'm really happy to see that the diversion findings went down in a world where the number of entities participating in a referral capture program is going up. So if you were an entity who were unsure whether you should do referrals, I think this is the good sign for you. And if you're on sort of, you're weighing that decision, you're not sure if this is going to make your program more risky, at least this set of audit stats shows that entities are in general having less diversion findings, and that referrals and good referral policies and good referral program execution can actually be a huge benefit for covered entities without increasing the risk of diversion. Because I know that was one of the fears, that was one of the concerns with this early on. There was an entity that had a no auditable records. Look, I know there's still a lot of EMR conversions going on. There's TPA changes going on. Just please save your data. If you are switching from one TPA to another, make sure that you get a download of all of your 340B claims, preferably since the beginning of your 340B program with that TPA, so that you can have that handy in case you're audited by HRSA. You have that information. Same goes for your split billing utilization if you're a hospital. Same goes for your purchases. If you're changing wholesalers, you want to keep that information stored in a centralized place in case you're audited in the middle of going through a transition. I've been there as well, where you're audited in the middle of a TPA transition, so you have to use data from the prior TPA and data from the new TPA, and that can also come with its own challenges as well. All right, so it looks like we're doing great on time. Corrective action plan. So let's say you go through a HRSA audit and you get that dreaded letter that says, hey, we found some things wrong with your program. You need to go through a corrective action plan. So if you get a diversion finding or a duplicate discount finding or an incorrect OPIS records finding, you have to then submit a corrective action plan. So the entity puts this plan together, you get a template, you describe your plan to remediate, and then you remediate each and you have to submit the proof. So if you're doing a repayment, for example, on a prescription that you ended up buying incorrectly at 340B, you have to submit proof that you closed that with the manufacturer. So whether it is that you offer the manufacturer a repayment for the incorrect purchase, or the manufacturer says, hey, you know what, it's okay, don't worry about it, it's only a couple of pennies or whatever, you want to keep that documentation so that you can submit it in your sort of like your proof of closing the cap or the corrective action plan or that finding specifically. Make sure you stay on top of this and make sure that the audit is closed. You don't want to keep that audit open forever, but you want to make sure that it's closed and addressed as quickly as possible, so that you can close your audit, move on with your life, implement the things. Sometimes you'll get improvements or things that HRSA wants to see in terms of policies and things like that. And those are important, I think, as well, to just implement to have you better prepared for the next time that there is an audit. So that is all that I have. Again, we like to keep these to 30 minutes. We don't want to waste anyone's time. We want you to get as much information as possible in the 30 minutes. The discussions afterwards are always great. I see there's various Q&As, various questions. I think someone raised their hand. So Justin, I'll pass it back to you. Oh, don't forget, let me say one more thing. Don't forget, we posted the link to the Genesis decision, the actual court ruling, in the chat. Feel free to download that if you have time and read it. It's pretty good stuff. So go ahead and read that. And Justin, I'll send it back to you.
Anthony, I think I'd love to see with our, we have such a good webinar following. I'd love to hear from the attendees if they've been through a HRSA audit and kind of how it went for them, any kind of insights into it, if they would offer that. We keep it anonymous, obviously, but be able to provide the rest of the attendees with what our other attendees went through and just kind of a firsthand, because we know we've seen it, we've done it. Luckily, our customers haven't had any findings, but it's one of those things where I'd love to hear from the attendees as far as how it went with them, because you don't hear much, right? You kind of keep it to yourself, and I would think the rest of the 340B community, we're a tight-knit group, would love to hear some of the pitfalls and insights into it. But just my thoughts.